this program. The featured cities, our featured speaker for day 3 of the Rural Progress Summit, David Daley, is a senior fellow for Fair Vote and the author of Rat Blank, the true story behind the secret plan to steal American democracy, which helped spark the recent drive to reform gerrymandering. David's second book, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy, chronicles the victories and the defeats in state efforts to reform elections and uphold voting rights. He's going to tell us how we got into this current mess of gerrymandering that we're in, but he's also going to offer us some views on how current redistricting cycle is playing out. David, thank you so much for joining us at One Country and joining the Rural Progress Summit. I look so forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, Senator. A pleasure to be here. A pleasure to follow this amazing panel. Secretary Espy, Representative Hoadley, who plays a role in the Michigan chapter in Rat Bleeped. So it's a pleasure to be around friends and so many of you who are doing this really difficult work. So thank you for having me. Redistricting is underway in state capitals nationwide. I'd like to lay out the state of play a little bit, offer some thoughts on what it might mean for rural districts and rural political power. I know firsthand how this affects so many of you. It affects me. I'm coming to you from the western Massachusetts hill towns who've long been ignored by our powerful congressman who's a Democrat, the chairman of Ways and Means, but he's safely kept in power by the big city, which really runs the engine of this district. And so the issues that often affect us out here, rural broadband, transportation, help for small farms, hospitals, opioids, we'd love more help on those issues. So there's big consequences at stake here. The census data, of course, released this summer, they showed us that over the course of the last decade, rural America has shrunk. The country's become more urban. You've got more than 85% of us now living in metropolitan areas larger than 50,000 people, while metro areas surged more than half of the nation's counties, especially some of those smaller rural counties from central Pennsylvania to Nebraska, from West Virginia south to Oklahoma, lost population. And so how these lines are going to be drawn really make a difference. The maps that are being enacted right now in state capitals nationwide will determine who hold power, and they will define the next decade of our politics, just as it defined the last one. By most measures, many of the statewide plans that were drawn in the past decade have rated as some of the most partisan and unrepresentative in the modern era. There's a slide here about what happened in Wisconsin over the course of the last decade, and you can really see exactly how the state assembly there was really wildly gerrymandered to the extent that you could have about 210,000 more votes for Democratic candidates, and Republicans still hold on to a super majority in the state assembly, even in the bluest of blue wave years. Harvard's Electoral Integrity Project does they do an annual study of the integrity of district lines, is one of the criteria as they are judging the health of American democracy in our states. And also they use that same criteria to compare around the world. And there have been years in this last decade where Wisconsin and North Carolina have gotten a 3 and a 4, respectively. That's on a scale of 100. And a 3 and a 4 is not on the good side. It's not where you want to be. In fact, there have been years in which the integrity of the district lines in Wisconsin and North Carolina were worse than any nation in the world, according to the scores that that project handed out. So Republicans were widely understood to have had a big edge in redistricting in 2010 and taken full advantage of it. I think Democrats really missed the importance of this in 2010. They've awakened and tried to claw back seats at the table. Voters, meanwhile, really tired of all of this chicanery, have embraced independent commissions or worked to create new guardrails nearly wherever they've been on the ballot over the course of the last decade. Red states, blue states, purple states. Nevertheless, I think the hardball that we've seen over the last couple of weeks in Texas and Oregon and Ohio, today in Illinois, the behavior this cycle across party lines really suggests that this is likely to be worse this year for several reasons. Number one, control of Congress is tight. The backdrop of this, of course, is that 5 seats separate the two parties in Congress. The redistricting taking place right now could determine who controls Congress for a decade. Number two is that federal courts have ceded the playing field. This is the first redistricting since the 2019 case Common Cause versus Rucho, which effectively closed the federal courts to partisan gerrymandering claims as a non-justiciable political issue. It's also the first cycle since the Shelby County versus Holder case effectively gutted the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, which would have required that largely Southern, but not entirely Southern states run these maps by the Department of Justice and get them approved to ensure that they did not go backwards on minority voting rights. The courts effectively have given state legislatures a green light for a festival of partisan gerrymandering, and they've taken away any speed limit. Third, I would say that this is likely to be another intense year of gerrymandering because we're better and better at it. The technology has really kicked gerrymandering into the steroids era. Today's extreme gerrymanders involve terabytes of voter data, sophisticated geographic information system software, supercomputers, armies of lawyers. The computers are faster, the data more precise, our voting patterns easier to predict. These lines can be drawn with such surgical precision that the party in charge holds a decade-long advantage. Which brings us to a reason for, right? It works in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Florida, North Carolina, Michigan, Wisconsin. 6 swing states, all redistricted by Republicans in 2011. They were able to hold both chambers of the state legislature for the last 10 years, even when they win hundreds of thousands of fewer votes. So the maps that were drawn in 2010 are still tilting the Congress and state houses toward Republicans a decade later. And lastly, I would say that we're likely to see more gerrymandering this year because it's become central to the Republican strategy. We are headed down what I think is a dark road of watching one of our major political parties try to hold power from the minority, trying to use voting rules and district lines to hold back demographic trends. And that requires constantly rewriting electoral rules to your favor. It's something we all ought to be extraordinarily concerned about as we head towards 2022 and 2024. But before we do that, I think it's worth a quick look back at this last cycle to understand just how far-reaching the consequences of this can be. Because in many ways, the state of play in 2021 was really created a decade ago. Republicans looking for a path back to power after the 2008 Barack Obama wave recognized the long-term implications of winning state legislatures and controlling redistricting. They called their strategy REDMAP, short for the Redistricting Majority Project. And you can see in these slides just how aptly it was named. If you take a look at this first one, you see what legislative control looked like in 2009. And, and then you can see the next one where it is by 2017. Boom. And the next one shows you where we stand right now in 2021. And it's still pretty much in exactly the same place. You can see how little has changed. After the 2018 midterms, 59 million of us lived in a state in which one or both chambers of the state legislature were controlled by the party that won fewer overall votes that November. It's nearly 1 in 6 of us, and that's 8 years deep into a cycle at a time when the advantages baked into gerrymanders have in the past historically begun to wane. And spoiler alert, all 59 million of those Americans, by the way, lived in a state where Democratic candidates won more votes and Republicans held power anyway. It reshaped the fight for Congress as well as state legislatures. You can see the next slide as well. If you're thinking about the states that Barack Obama carried in 2012, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Florida, the congressional delegations in states that Obama carried, 62 Republicans and 25 Democrats. Democrats win 1.4 million more votes in 2012, and yet Republicans hold the House anyway. So in many ways, I think the lesson of the last decade is that when you have control of this process, it's a whole lot easier to keep control, and that maps do not lessen in their impact. And this is different than it's been in the past. The maps that are going to be drawn this year could potentially flip the House on their own. More than that, I think that they could allow Republicans to hold on to the House with millions of fewer votes. 2012, it was 1.4 million. Well, in 2020, Democrats won 4.7 million more votes for the US House. They only won 5 more seats. So you can see what Republicans are able to do, and we'll walk through some of the states, but what they might be able to do in Texas and Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, a handful of other states alone represents much more than 5 seats. And when you look at what Democrats are able to do to try and counter that on the other side, it's still, an advantage for the Republicans well over what they would need to flip control, which means if you could run the exact same election on these new lines, you'd almost certainly have had a different result. If you want to take a look at this next slide, it shows you how states redistrict. And in most states, as you can see, it is, in fact, the state legislatures that have this power. If you want to move on to the next one, what we also see is that there's a dwindling number of swing seats that are available out there to be captured. And if you want to take a look at the next one, you can see that the number of districts represented by a candidate of the opposing party that won the presidential election, that dropped in 2020 to its lowest level in 70 years. It's just 16 of 435. So in many ways, what I think we're likely to see this cycle is going to confirm that the opportunity to flip seats either way has moved from every other November in congressional elections to every 10 years following the US Census. If you want to take a look at the next slide, it's going to show you how the map this cycle favors Republicans slightly less than the advantage they had in 2011, but in their favor nevertheless. What has changed is that Republicans will control the drawing of 187 of the 435 seats. Democrats will control 75. There will be joint control over 71 and commissions that draw 96. So you've got a handful of states where there's more joint control than you had last time. That's largely thanks to Democrats winning governor's races in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And you've got more commissions drawing these lines in places like Colorado, Virginia, and Michigan. When I say that Republicans have got the upper hand, though, it's not just about the number of seats that they will draw. It's about where they have control. Sometimes I like to call this the Willie Keeler strategy of gerrymandering, right? He used to rob banks because that's where the money is. And if you're trying to do a gerrymander this cycle, you have to go where the seats are. And Republicans have got the keys to the safes in many of those states. I mean, Democrats control, Maryland and Rhode Island. You're not going to get anything else there. Republicans can't add seats in Wyoming or in Idaho, right? But the important Republican edge in 2021 is that they've got control in states where there's gains to be made, competitive states with a lot of seats, or states that are gaining seats after apportionment. You're talking about Florida, North Carolina, tightening states with changing demographics like Texas and Georgia. Again, it can be possible to pick up double digits right there and potentially swing the House with new maps in those states alone. You can see that Democrats are trying to claw back in the places where they can. Republicans are trying to expand their majority in key states and also to shore up districts where demographics have changed against them. Texas, I think, is one of the really interesting places to look at. 95% of the population growth in Texas, according to the US Census, has been driven by minority population growth, largely Latino and Asian. But communities of color lose power under the congressional maps that were proposed in Texas and enacted earlier this month. It's currently a 23-13 state, and you're going to get 2 additional seats after reapportionment. So in 2020, you had 22 districts that were carried by Trump and 14 carried by Biden. That, under this new map, is going to move to 25-13. And then if you look at the racial breakdown of these districts, you had 22 white districts, 8 majority Latino districts, and 1 majority Black district. That's going to go from 22 to 23 majority white districts, from 8 Latino districts down to 7, and from 1 majority black seat down to 0. In Georgia and in North Carolina, I think you're going to see the importance of both the Common Cause versus Rucho decision, as well as the impact of preclearance. We've only seen draft maps there, but what it looks like so far is that Republicans are going to attempt to overpack black voters into a handful of seats. And without preclearance and without the ability to use the federal courts to fight a partisan gerrymandering claim, they can, if sued, eventually try and defend that map by saying, we weren't doing a racial gerrymander, we were doing a partisan gerrymander. We weren't necessarily discriminating against black voters, we were simply discriminating against Democrats who happened to be black voters. I think that's the argument you are really going to hear over the course of the next couple of years. What you're also going to see, I think, are Republicans trying to crack blue cities in red states, and this, I think, is going to be something to watch, especially in rural states. If you're thinking about Tennessee, if you're thinking about Kentucky, I could imagine Louisville being cracked in half. Republicans looking for a map that allows them every seat. In Tennessee, they've already talked about drawing a line down the middle of Nashville, attaching half of the city to more rural conservative interests and half out the other way. Democrats have got fewer opportunities to do the same thing. The Willie Keeler strategy is not in their favor. They can go into Maryland, they can go into Oregon, New Mexico, maybe grab 1 seat in each of those states. New York and Illinois would be the 2 places where they've got the most opportunity. And I think that what you might be thinking about as you look at those maps, if Democrats go after big seat gains in those states, they're probably going to do so with a similar strategy as Republicans, right? It's going to be trying to attach enough blue votes in Chicago or New York City and then drawing districts that go out into rural areas. And I think that's got the real potential for perhaps Democrats gaining seats, but perhaps rural interests losing power and influence that they might have right now in some of those states. What this cracking has meant in reality for us all, when seats are drawn in this way, it's got a real effect on our politics. If you look at North Carolina, Republicans came in 2011 determined to draw a 10-3 map, famously, in this purple state. And the key to drawing that map was the city of Asheville, a hippie, liberal, a vegan cafe college town out in the western part of the state, the biggest city in western North Carolina, surrounded by rural mountain towns. And it had been a real swing seat. It had gone back and forth for the previous decade. And once Asheville was cracked in half, attached to 2 other places, it becomes a deeply conservative district. And it would be represented after 2012 by a man who had been a proprietor of a small town sandwich shop called Aunt D's. His name was Mark Meadows. The masterstroke, of course, is just driving a line across the middle of Asheville, cutting it in half, scattering the district's only significant concentration of Democrats across 2 districts where Democrats didn't have much of a chance to win. And Meadows kind of famously read the temperature of the district one day at a Tea Party rally that summer. He was asked if he would pursue an investigation into President Obama's citizenship, and his leading opponent dissembled, and Meadows gave a direct answer and said yes. And then he smirked as the crowd laughed its approval. He said, "You know what? we'll send him back home to Kenya or wherever it is. And it was in that moment that Donald Trump's future chief of staff was on his path to real political power. North Carolina's 11th wasn't the only district with a new face in that Congress. If the demographic change driving American politics was a nation that was becoming more multiracial, for example, Republicans built a majority in the House and in state legislatures by creating districts where the opposite held true. The New Yorker goes ahead and crunched the numbers after Meadows led the government shutdown in 2013. And what they found was that the average House Republican district became 2 percentage points whiter in 2012, and that caucuses that backed Meadows' stunt were 12 percentage points whiter than the average district. That this was a nation in which Barack Obama lost the presidential election in 2012 by 23 points, even though he actually won nationally by 4. And Republicans drew themselves a nation where their base gained power even as their base shrunk. It was a land where America became whiter even as the exact opposite dynamic had taken hold. And they did this in part by, packing rural districts. You get Mark Meadows. You didn't get rural broadband out of that, right? And I would say what this means, and it was so interesting and heartening to see the comments at the end of the last panel from John Hoadley and others, because I think it's right. I think that what this means in the end is that Democrats have stopped trying to win in too many places, and Republicans have made it so that the Republican primary in too many places is the only race that matters. That has led to a politics of outrage, right? That as many districts have become more rural, your political power is not necessarily grown. You haven't necessarily gotten action on the issues that matter to you. We've simply lost competition. We've lost coalitions. It's all helped accelerate Democrats into a party of the college-educated, creative class, and Republicans into something that I would call performatively populist, anti-government, anti-critical race theory, anti-voting. But what does rural America win in this deal? You've got one party that isn't focused on you all the time, and another that is more interested in keeping people angry than solving problems. And I would suggest that when it is harder for Democrats to vote, it isn't necessarily better for in cities to vote. That also creates difficulties to vote for rural Americans who might be far from a ballot box, who might really enjoy the opportunity to vote via mail, right? I want to try to end this on an up note. I went out and did a chapter in Unrigged on Idaho and the Reclaim Idaho movement and how they expanded Medicaid there in this one-party state that 5 years in a row had said no to expanding Medicaid. And they created a new group. They worked outside the party structure, that they went the initiative route, which is not easy to do in Idaho. You need signatures in every corner of the state. And I went out there and I joined them and I watched as they went to northern Idaho and they went to eastern Idaho, went up in the mountains and door knocked and talked to people and really just lived in these communities. And they won. They won in 2018 with 63% of the vote, which is good for rural healthcare, for rural hospitals, for the 100,000 people who suddenly now have access to affordable healthcare during a pandemic. And I think that it suggests that these divides can be healed, but that it takes people showing up with solutions, that we really can replace the empty politics of outrage with a new politics of outreach, but that it starts with showing up, and it starts with showing up in rural America. But thank you.
Thank you so much, David. If you would just hang on with me a little bit, because if I wasn't depressed about the midterms and what's going to happen in the future before your presentation, you certainly have given us all a wake-up call. But I want to reiterate with you the importance of 50 states participating in democracy, not just simply turning over public policy to one political party and one ideology. And yesterday we had two very bright interns who were looking at how do you do that outreach? How do you get these ideas out there? The important part of this is, to me, why the courts have abandoned this space. You look at the numbers, and it's frightening to think about that many Democratic votes, but yet the overwhelming supermajorities in many of these states, even in North Dakota. I mean, you look at our legislature, it's a super majority. North Dakota is not, that red, but yet the representation in the Senate and in the House in our states is just overwhelmingly Republican, and it really prevents good ideas from coming to the front. How do we get the courts reengaged, I guess, is my question to you.
It's a great question, and I think perhaps it starts with passing the Freedom to Vote Act, because right now the federal courts have really closed themselves off to these claims at just the moment that we needed them most to really stand up for voters. At exactly the moment in which federal courts around the country, judges appointed by presidents of both parties in cases out of Maryland and Ohio and North Carolina and Wisconsin and Michigan, had looked at not only the evidence that the gerrymanderers left behind in their draft maps and their emails, but all of these new computer-based tools of evaluating districts, and really seen that these were dramatic outliers designed to lock in partisan control for a decade. And judges said, we need to be involved and we have the tools to figure this out. And the Supreme Court said no and closed the doors. State Supreme Courts provide a road back. In Pennsylvania and in North Carolina in 2018 and 2019, you had really extreme partisan gerrymanders overturned under state constitutional provisions protecting free and fair elections. And more than half of our state constitutions have protections like that. So that can be a road for folks. To be realistic, it's probably not a road in Georgia, right? It's probably not a road in Florida or in Texas, where those state Supreme Courts have been locked up as well. But it could be elsewhere. It's certainly not worth giving up on. But there are such tremendous anti-partisan gerrymandering provisions in the Freedom to Vote Act, and that if we can pass laws that ban partisan gerrymandering, we can push this back into the courts and get another crack at this.
Yeah, I mean, certainly into the federal courts. But if people out there are looking at their state and saying, what can I do? If you have a state that allows you to initiate a constitutional provision, just as David was talking about what happened with Medicaid expansion, many of those places where they haven't expanded, whether it's Missouri, whether it is taking a look at Idaho, Utah, where the people have stepped up, we can do that kind of organizing. And I think when you ask people, no matter what their political stripe is, do you want to get politics? Do you want to just hand over your public policy to political parties, or do you want the democracy to work? I think they're going to overwhelmingly vote for the democracy. And so it's just a matter of not putting all our eggs in one basket. We put our eggs in the basket of the courts, we're going to be thwarted, right, by a partisan Supreme Court. We put all of our eggs in the basket of winning local elections. This is such an important right. I think there needs to be constitutional protections as well. And so
I agree. It's going to take a different road in every state. The strategy to get out of this has to be state-based, and there will need to be 50 different strategies. But initiatives, where they're allowed, have worked. There is, certainly proof that, whether it's Utah, whether it's the original initiative in Missouri in 2018 before the legislature came back and kind of hijacked that, whether it's Ohio or Florida or Virginia, Michigan, Colorado, we're talking about the blue states and red states and purple states. Voters hate gerrymandering. Even in this moment in which, voting rights has become contentious and partisan, you can get 60, 70% in states across the political spectrum to say that people should be drawing these lines, not politicians.
Absolutely. And I want to thank you so much for the work that you're doing. The research is invaluable, but we need to take action. It's not enough to know of the problems. We've got to resolve to believe that this is our generation's greatest challenge on democracy, and challenge to democracy, and we need to fix this. Thanks so much, David, and you have a great rest of your weekend, and keep up your great work.
Thank you.